Hey everybody, my name is Sean Galanos. I'm a love coach and I will be doing these lives twice a week until, I don't know, indefinitely on subjects around sexuality, intimacy, relationships, love, dating, vulnerability, and communication, how to have better, more loving relationships. And today we're talking about sexual health, right? So how to have the conversation about sexual health before having sex with a new person. And just to be clear, if you've already had sex with somebody and you haven't had this conversation, you can still have this conversation, right? So step one, obviously, this makes sense to me, get tested, right? It's a lot hotter to have a conversation with someone about sexual health when you can say, I was tested recently, like last week or last month, rather than the last time I was tested was 3 years ago. It's a lot hotter for you to take responsibility for your sexual health and to get tested as often as necessary. And I'm not a sexual health educator, but I have had this conversation a lot in my life. So this is how I approach this conversation. If you're watching this live and you have comments, leave the comments. I might be able to pin one of them. So number one, get tested, right? Especially if you have lots of partners or you've had many partners, then you want to get tested more often. If you've only had one partner in the last year, then it's maybe not as important to get tested often, but get tested, especially if it's been a while, or if you're out of a new relationship, or if you're out of a relationship and you're getting into a new relationship, it's nice to get tested and to have that information, right? It also makes this conversation way easier. Okay, so before we jump into how to have this conversation, just know that STIs, also commonly referred to as STDs, are part of being a sexually active adult. This is just part of the game. If you want to have sex, it will include some risk of getting an STI. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person if you get one. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that you did it wrong. Some of these STIs are like show no symptoms and can still be transmitted, right? So you can still do everything in your power to be safe and still get an STI. So the reality is that it's totally normal. It's part of being a sexually active adult. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's totally something that you probably will feel shame about. Just know that it's not required. But, and we call them STIs now, sexually transmitted infections, not sexually transmitted diseases, because the word infection is sort of like less shameful than a disease, right? Like an infection. It's just like when you cut your finger and it's like a little red, you have an infection. You don't have a finger disease, right? So same thing applies to your genitals. It's an infection. Most of them can be cleared up. Again, I'm not a sexual health educator, but I've had this conversation a lot, and I am a communication love coach. This fits into the umbrella of how to have awesome sex, is being able to have these conversations. So first of all, the first thing you're not going to do is you're not going to ask, are you clean? Because that assumes that if you're not, you're dirty. And just because you have an STI or you've had an STI or someone has an STI doesn't mean they're dirty, right? So we don't look at this in clean versus dirty. We look at the test results as negative versus positive. So I got tested and the test came back negative, right? The test came back negative, not I am clean. Huge difference here, right? Furthermore, you are responsible for your sexual health and the sexual health of your partner, right? If both people are responsible, then you're going to have a more pleasurable, safer experience. And just to touch on the word safe, safe sex, there is no safe sex unless you're not having sex. No sex equals safe sex. All sex is inherently risky because there are infections out there. And having this conversation getting tested and sexual health, like sexual barriers, and are ways of reducing that risk, right? So at the end of the day, you are responsible for your sexual health. And in my experience, if I don't bring this conversation up before having sex, there's a good chance they're not going to bring it up either, right? If I don't talk about it, they might not talk about it. So if I am responsible for my sexual health, then it's my responsibility to bring it up first, regardless of whether they were going to bring it up later. I don't know if they were or they're going to or not. I know that I can, right? So if you don't, they might not. And that's the equivalent of like burying your head in the sand and hoping that everything's going to be okay. So when to have this conversation? This might seem obvious to some of you. Do it before your clothes come off. It's a lot easier to have this conversation while you're making out than it is when you're already naked and getting busy, right? So do it before your clothes come off or before you touch any genitals, right? Because STIs are transmitted through sexual contact, right? So you can touch somebody's penis or vulva, and then you can touch your face or your own penis or vulva or butthole, and you can spread it that way, even if your clothes are still on. So have this conversation before your clothes come off. And like I said, if you've already had sex with someone and you haven't had this conversation, you could totally still have this conversation, and you should. I don't like using the word should. You should. Okay. This is how to have it, right? This is not like a 30-second conversation. This is like a 5-minute conversation between two people because it involves quite a bit of information that needs to be translated. Okay. This is how you have it. Before the clothes come off, you say, this seems like a good time to talk about sexual health. This is just a good time. This seems like a good time. Not, I need to talk about it or we should talk about it. This is a great time. It's like universally known as a great time to talk about sexual health before we have sex, right? 1 sec. Cool. And then they will say, okay, sure. And then you can go, I'll go first because you're bold and you are responsible and you are watching this video. So you have the information that they might not have. And by the way, when you do this, you show them that it's okay for them to also do it. Okay. The last time I was tested was 3 months ago. And when I got tested, the results of that test or those tests were negative. I've had 2 partners since that last test. And I've had this conversation with both those partners, and their tests were also negative. So it makes sense to talk about whether you've had sexual contact or encounters since your last test, because then that does change the risk profile, right? If you say I was tested 2 years ago, I've had 40 partners since then, I'm less likely to just go off the results of that test and more likely to go off the likelihood of you have gotten some kind of infection in the last 40 partners, right? So that's why it's nice to get tested often, because you could say, I got tested last month and I've had 2 partners since then. And I've had this conversation with those partners and their tests were also negative. And you could see how the more partners you have, the riskier it becomes, because the more partners you have, those partners also have other partners. This is why it's important to get tested often, early and often. It's sort of like salting when you're cooking, early and often. Okay. My sexual health practices are, so I'm just going to speak personally, I use barriers, condoms, for penetrative sex and no barriers for oral sex. That's just my risk profile, right? So I want you to know what I've done with my past partner since I was last tested for you to evaluate whether this is going to work for you or not, right? And you might say like, oh, that's cool. I would prefer that we use a condom for oral sex or a dental dam for oral sex if that's something that is part of your practice, right? I currently have. So if you have some of the STIs that are sort of can be treated but not cured, like HPV, right? Human papillomavirus, warts, can cause cervical cancer in women, or HSV, herpes, or HIV. Though you want to say that, right? Because it doesn't matter when the last time you were tested or if they were treated, because they can't be cured and you always have them. So you could say, I have HSV. I haven't had an outbreak in 2 months. I am currently taking suppressive antivirals every day. And usually I know when an outbreak is coming because I can sort of feel like symptoms of like itching or burning. Or I have had HPV for a really long time. I used to have warts when I was younger. I haven't seen any symptoms of HPV for the last 3 years. And I also was vaccinated against HPV using Gardasil 9 or whatever. So if you have an STI, it's your responsibility to get really, really, really educated about that STI so that you can share that information, which is where you go, here's what I know about HSV. And you share with them what you know and how it relates to you and your symptoms, right? That's sort of what the conversation looks like. And then you say, do you have any questions? And then they can ask you any questions they have about any STIs you might have or about your sexual health practices, the encounters that you've had in the past, when you got tested, what those results were, right? So you are giving them all the information that they need to have an informed decision, to make an informed decision about whether they want to go through with the encounter. And then once you've answered all their questions, you say, your turn. And then they go, right? And because you've done such a complete job of sharing all that information, it empowers them to also share with you the same level of information and the same amount of like context and content, right? Instead of just saying, I'm negative. Like if you just say I'm negative, I'm going to be like, I have some questions. When was the last time you were tested? How many partners have you had since then? Okay, pause. That's what the conversation looks like. Okay, now I have some additional thoughts around this. This is not a mood killer. This conversation is not a mood killer. If having this conversation kills the mood was not that strong. Their desire to have sex with you was not that strong, right? Or if this kills the mood or the vibe, maybe that's not someone that you want to have sex with. Also, this takes practice. I have HPV and I got it when I was like 17 and I'm 39 now. So I've had to have this conversation for a long time with a lot of different people. And it does get easier. The more you do it, the easier it gets, right? If they don't like what you have to say, right? They don't feel comfortable moving forward. They can say something like, you know what? I'm not comfortable having sex with you with these, with what you've told me. I would either like to suggest a different activity like making out or massage or something that doesn't involve our genitals. I would like to put a pin in this for tonight so that I can do more information or do more research and get more information about how I can stay protected. Or, this isn't going to work for me. And I really appreciate you being honest, right? Those are sort of the three options that could come up. And all three are valid, right? You're giving them this information so that they can make an informed decision about how to move forward with you. And you also kind of have to be okay with the fact that some people are not going to want to move forward. They're not going to want to have sex with you because you have an STI, if you have an STI. And just like you're allowed to not have sex with someone based on the information that they give you, right? This is what it means to have healthy sexual relationships. It's to also accept the fact that sometimes they're not going to want to hook up with you and that they have to accept the fact that you might not want to hook up with them, right? So this is what it looks like. There are no questions. Oh, here's a question. I'm 45 and single. I noticed that in my age group, it's a bit uncomfortable. Let's say in their 20s are so much easygoing about it. No taboo. Yeah, sure. I think the older generation didn't have access to this information from an early age. Younger folks now have this information. Not everywhere. Of course, it really depends where you live, who you're exposed to, what kind of education you received in school. Like in the United States, it's pretty much like non-existent, right? Like in Denmark or in Finland, I forget exactly where, they start having they start having sex education at the age of 4 years old, right? So they're going to have a much different comfort level with this stuff. So that's it. This is how to have the conversation. This is one way of having it. It's okay for it to be awkward. It's okay for it to be clunky. It's okay for you to not really know how to do this. I would rather you try and it be really awkward than to not do it at all. I would really I want you to try. Baby steps. Hey, this seems like a great time to talk about sexual health. I watched this video. This guy, a love coach or whatever, Sean, was talking about how to have this conversation. Are you willing to like try this, do this thing with me? Because I've never really done it. I feel embarrassed that I don't know how to do this better, but here I am. This is the reality of the situation. I think you're super hot. I'd love to fuck the shit out of you. I'd love to talk about how we can fuck the shit out of each other in a safe way by sharing our sexual health history and practices. Okay, everybody. Thank you for playing. I'll be doing this twice a week until just twice a week. Have a beautiful day. Good luck. Go have hot, sexy, kinky sex, and be as safe as possible. Ciao.